You've all touched on this, but is there an answer to the question, how different are men and women?
I think about this a lot, actually. I struggle with it because sex differences is a huge and growing area of research, as you could tell, and a very important one. I think sometimes when people are healthy, at least with respect to the brain, we need to know about the differences, but sometimes the differences don't make a huge difference. But it's really important to know about those differences when people get sick, when somebody has a tumor, or when somebody's taking medication, or if they have autism, or if they have depression. So I think it's really important to study them, but I think it's important to be circumspect. I don't believe that women are from Venus and men are from Mars.
You don't?
I do not. I think that actually gender is very interesting in that respect, and I think you did use the word gender correctly. I applaud you. Gender pushes, I think, sometimes what isn't so different to make it more different. And so I think we always want to...
In terms of behavior.
In terms of behavior. So I think we always want to think about that. But I think it's important to study sex differences. I think it's critical.
I think
all those mice?
One thing to remember is we usually study averages. So for example, men are on average taller than women. It doesn't mean if all of you stood up, that there wouldn't be some women who are taller than some men. And height is actually a much stronger predictor of sex than most of the phenotypes we talk about in the brain or in cognitive behaviors. So are there differences if you compare 100 women to 100 men? Yes. Do they necessarily predict exactly what any one person is like? Rarely. And so it's something to remember when we're talking about averages. Averages are almost always defined by their exceptions as much as they are by their means.
Well, and also, you're right, in that sense, what does different mean?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think when you're thinking about difference, I think one of the things that's really important is coming to the understanding that difference doesn't mean better or worse. Difference just means different. And so one of the things we do in science all the time is we have a comparator. We're always thinking about the norm. And of course, in real life, we're always thinking about what's normal, what's not normal. And the norm has actually always been the XY animal, be it a human or be it a mouse. But I think what we have to begin to accept is that there's a huge diversity and that it's important to know what the range is and that we shouldn't think of being different as being abnormal. It's just different.
And I was one of those people who wasn't going to raise my daughters as girls and bought the boy toys. And I remember one birthday party, I bought everyone got a straw that was wildly, wrinkled. And every boy at the party had a sword and a gun out of it, and every girl had a wand. And I was mesmerized that they were 4 years old, and they were different. They responded differently to things. It wasn't acclimation.
Are we finding more, as people, and you talk about gender awareness, and the whole transgender issue has really dominated news in the last while. Are you seeing, is there a continuum? Is there XY, XXY, XX? Or are you really thinking XX, XY?
There are conditions where you have XXY. That's a fairly rare syndrome. And there's XXX, et cetera. So I don't think that's the same thing as the discussion of
not
transgender.
This is chromosomal, so yes.
I think that's a very complicated question.
It's all right. You don't have to answer.
And I think it's a really interesting one. And of course, people are studying the brains of trans individuals and gay individuals, and they're using the science to try to explain why this part of the brain is a little bit bigger or this part of the brain is a little bit smaller. But I don't think the evidence is incredibly convincing yet. And I think it's we're all in this for the intellectual thrill. And so I think the search is fascinating. And the different interpretations we come up with are really interesting. But I don't know that there's going to be some hardcore biological reason that isn't born out of the biology that comes from experience.
I heard you talking about your mice. I thought, well, that seems obvious. I say, as if, I would have had that idea. But why is that a radical idea? Why is that a change? Why did that require somebody saying now, yes, we must do that?
It's not radical, but it is the idea that we want to use the fewest animals we can.
Yeah, and you explained that very well, actually.
So it's both the ethics and the cost associated with it. So if you're making the assumption that it's just a model system and a male mouse is as good of a model of a disease as a female mouse is, then why not stick with one? And then you also get into a bit of the history of it. If you have 10 studies previously that have shown something in male mice, it's easier to have your 11th study compared to those previous 10 than to suddenly switch sexes.
But we have known for quite a while that there are differences.
But what's becoming striking is where the differences matter. Yeah. So are there differences? Yes, and that was always known. I mean, female mice way less, there's differences in the brains. But if you suspect what happens if I take this one gene out, the assumption was the same thing happens by and large. And it's not that people have never used mice of both sexes, they have. And usually the answer will be the same, no matter whether you use male mice or female mice or both. But it's in those exceptions where really fascinating science lies. And the case of which cells mediate chronic pain is a drastic example. Most aren't that drastic. But you're looking at these disorders that have these strikingly divergent sex ratios, whether it's autism or depression, pain. We have to understand those to understand the disorders in the first place.
Yeah, and I think there's a very powerful statistic that between 1998 and 2001, 8 out of 10 drugs were taken off the market because of adverse effects in women. They had never been tested in women. The mice that are the first stage before you get to human beings, they were all male, so there was no evidence to take it to human females. So it is really important, I think, when it comes to illness. And that's where I think we should be really focusing our attention.
And the best outcome, the vision is this would be normal. I mean, if we're, studying and understanding things, continuing along where we're going now?
Yes, well, I think it's a very important part of personalized medicine. People talk about personalized medicine, but they never include whether the animal is XX or XY, or whether, people want to know the whole genome, but it doesn't, we need to understand whether they're XX or XY or something in between as part of the whole constellation. Mm-hmm. And I think if we think of it that way, it's part of our genome. It's going to interact differently. Different drugs are going to interact differently with a different constellation of genes. We need to know it.
Mm-hmm. Now, we do have a couple of microphones set up.
If women take HRT for periods beyond 5 years and 10 years, does that reduce their rates of dementia?
Epidemiological studies show that the incidence of dementia is, as we say in science, titrated. It's titrated by whether you have 2 ovaries removed or 1 ovary removed. It's titrated by whether you have your ovaries removed before natural menopause or after natural menopause. And it's also titrated by hormone replacement. And there's a number of very good studies by a Canadian, Barbara Sherwin, showing that women who have their ovaries removed if the study's done within 2 months of ovarian removal, the women who have hormone replacement actually reverses the cognitive changes. If they don't have hormone replacement, they have problems with what we call verbal memory. So it can help a lot.
Any other questions? You're moving. I hope, you might be moving somewhere else. Come on up.
Thank you, everyone, for engineering this talk on such a significant day. And thank you for the work you're doing and the links and so on. I'm wondering, in terms of our narrative, if you are linked to Patients Canada in terms of all the points you were making about how to become more patient-centered.
I'm a volunteer on.
I think the mic, are you on?
Am I on? All right. I'm a volunteer on Patients Canada, and there are a number of fine organizations like that really working hard on the patient experience. I would say that the hospitals themselves are taking real steps to improve that and to understand it. It's built into now how the organization and its staff are evaluated. There are programs, partners in care, which are becoming very sophisticated. And I think across the board, in terms of education and compensation and an understanding of this, there are more and more deeper and wider programs on patient experience.
Absolutely. So I just brought it up for the audience to know that another link would be patientscanada.ca because they can volunteer, they can tell their stories, they can make a difference.
Yep.
We're not linked with Patient Canada, but I'm very glad to know about it. But we do, for all of our studies, we have community advisory groups. So we have a few people, 3 or 4 from the patient community, and we meet with them once, probably once every, 3 times a year. We don't want it to be a burden for them. But we talk about our findings. We ask them what they would like to have understood, maybe what some of the questions are that they're facing and would like us to do research on, in fact. Because I think patients are actually a huge source of ideas. They're the ones who have the experience, and they can lead you to really important questions.
I work for a company that's using EEGs to identify mental illness in patients and then select the best treatment for those patients. We've looked recently at differences between EEGs for male and female, and we can actually differentiate a woman's brain from a man's brain just by looking at the EEGs. That just confirms what everybody has been saying about the differences between male and female.
Well, maybe you should be on this panel. That's awesome. I can't do that.
And one comment to make on whether it's EEG or MRI or whatever, there's a fascinating set of sex differences where the outcome is the same between men and women, but some of the neural circuits that mediate the outcome is actually different. In some ways, the chronic pain is an example of that, where the chronic pain behavior in the mice was the same, but it was a different cell type that was mediating it. So very often we're actually detecting things in some of the imaging techniques in EEG and magnetic resonance imaging that don't reflect differences in behavior or outcome at the end of the day, but there's some different circuitry in how to get there.
Well, thank you very much for your comment. Just now, to wrap things up, I'd like to ask Dr. Tom Mickelson to come forward. He is the president and the scientific director of the Ontario Brain Institute. Just remember, OBI. Don't forget those initials.
That's right. Thanks, Valerie, and thanks for the audience. Thanks for coming out this evening. I'd just like to congratulate the panel for 5 exceptional talks on a very diverse range of topics on this important day. And of course, to be moderated by Valerie with her tremendous experience in communications through her work in radio and TV, but also as an advocate for mental health, has her own stake in the field. Everybody touched on a couple of very, very important and wide-ranging topics, basically challenging the presumption or assumptions that we make with regards to sex and gender, and thank you for clarifying that. But just to raise the specter that all of the assumptions and presumptions we make about patients and diseases and disorders need to be taken into account when we're looking at this. We all have biases, and we need to take them at face value and study them, in fact, in the correct way when we're trying to understand the mechanism of many of the disorders we're dealing with, and treat patients in this holistic way. And the diversity that we have is not just sex and gender, but it's got to do with background and expertise and life experience. So really, I think just reinforces the issue that we are managing patients and not diseases, and that was said several times, and I think just crystallizes the message for today. Sex is only, and gender is only one of those differences. So thanks again for the panel. Thanks for coming out this evening. A lot to think of on the way going home and engender some new conversations. Thanks again. Good night.
you.